The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town of Copper Ridge as Jack Morrison rode his weathered stallion through the main street. His leather boots were cracked from months of desert travel, and his hat shadowed a face marked by countless days under the unforgiving sky. The year was 1887, and the frontier was still a place where justice came from the barrel of a gun and mercy was rarer than water in the desert. Jack had been drifting for 3 years now. Ever since the incident in Texas that left him unable to return home, he carried secrets heavier than the Colt .45 on his hip, memories that haunted him through sleepless nights under star-filled skies. Today, something felt different about Copper Ridge. The usual bustle of frontier life seemed muted, replaced by an undercurrent of tension that made his horse nervous as he approached the town's center. A crowd had gathered near the old oak tree that served as both shade and gallows. Jack's stomach tightened as he recognized the setup. 2 wooden posts had been erected and rope lay coiled nearby like sleeping snakes. The townspeople whispered among themselves, their faces a mixture of excitement and unease. Some children pushed forward for a better view while their mothers pulled them back. Through the crowd, Jack caught sight of 2 young Apache women bound to the posts. They couldn't have been more than 20 years old, their dark hair hanging loose around their shoulders, their traditional clothing torn and dusty. Despite their predicament, they held their heads high with a dignity that commanded respect. The older of the 2 had fierce eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire, while the younger one trembled slightly but maintained her brave facade. Sheriff Coleman, a thick-set man with a gray mustache, stood addressing the crowd with the authority of someone who enjoyed his power too much. His deputy, a nervous young man named Peters, shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly having second thoughts about the day's events. The sheriff's voice carried across the square as he proclaimed the charges against the 2 women. "These Apache sisters," Coleman announced, "stand accused of murdering 3 innocent settlers near Willow Creek, Emma and Sarah Littlefoot, daughters of the war chief Running Bear, will face frontier justice for their crimes against civilized folk." The crowd murmured its approval. Though Jack noticed several people looking away uncomfortably, Jack dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden hitching post. Something about this situation didn't sit right with him. He had learned to read people during his years of wandering, and these 2 women didn't carry themselves like cold-blooded killers. Their eyes held pain and defiance, but not the cruel satisfaction he had seen in the faces of true murderers. Moving closer through the crowd, Jack overheard fragments of conversation that painted a clearer picture. Old Pete the blacksmith was telling his neighbor about the strange circumstances of the settlers' deaths. "Found 3 days ago," Pete whispered. "But the Apache camp was attacked 2 weeks before that. Mighty strange timing, if you ask me." The pieces began forming a puzzle in Jack's mind. He had witnessed enough frontier injustice to recognize it when he saw it. The timing didn't make sense, and the sheriff seemed too eager to rush the execution. There were always those who profited from conflict between settlers and native tribes, and Jack had learned to spot the signs of such manipulation. As the crowd grew larger, Jack noticed a group of well-dressed men standing apart from the regular townspeople. They wore expensive suits despite the desert heat and carried themselves with the confidence of money and influence. Their leader, a tall man with silver hair and coal-blue eyes, watched the proceedings with satisfaction. Jack recognized the type wealthy landowners who saw Apache land as their next acquisition. The sheriff began preparing the execution, his movements deliberate and theatrical. The crowd's energy was building to a dangerous crescendo, fed by years of fear and prejudice. Jack felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders. He could ride away and avoid trouble, as he had done so many times before. Or he could act on the growing certainty that an injustice was about to occur. Emma Littlefoot, the elder sister, began singing softly in her native tongue. Her voice carried across the square with haunting beauty, causing some in the crowd to fall silent. It was a death song, Jack realized, sung to honor the spirits and prepare for the journey to the next world. The younger sister, Sarah, joined her voice to the melody, and together they created a moment of profound dignity in the face of hatred. That song decided everything for Jack Morrison. He had heard such songs before, during his time as a cavalry scout years ago, before the incident that changed everything. He knew the Apache people well enough to recognize courage when he heard it, and these women possessed it in abundance. Whatever crimes they were accused of, they deserved better than this mob justice. Jack's hand moved instinctively to his gun belt, checking the familiar weight of his weapons. He carried 2 Colts and a rifle on his horse, tools of survival that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. But he also carried something more valuable, his knowledge of the truth that others seemed determined to ignore. The sun climbed higher, and the desert heat intensified the tension in the square. Jack knew he had only minutes before the execution would begin, and once it started, there would be no stopping it. The crowd was hungry for blood, and the sheriff was eager to satisfy them. But Jack Morrison had spent many years running from his past to stand by and watch injustice triumph again. As he prepared to act, Jack thought about the letter in his saddlebags, the one he had been carrying for months without the courage to deliver. It was addressed to a woman in California, an explanation and apology for events that had torn his life apart. Perhaps today would be the day he finally earned the right to seek redemption. The moment of decision had arrived, and Jack Morrison stepped forward into the crowd, ready to face whatever consequences his actions might bring. The desert had taught him many harsh lessons, but the most important was that sometimes a man had to stand up for what was right, regardless of the cost. Jack pushed through the crowd with deliberate calm, his weathered hands resting near his gun belt. The townspeople parted reluctantly, some recognizing the dangerous gleam in his eyes. Years of surviving on the frontier had taught him to project quiet authority when necessary. And today necessity demanded everything he had learned. "Hold on there, Sheriff," Jack called out, his voice cutting through the desert air like a blade. The crowd turned toward him, curious about this stranger who dared interrupt their grim entertainment. Sheriff Coleman's face darkened with annoyance as he sized up the newcomer, noting the well-worn guns and the confident stance of a man accustomed to trouble. "This ain't your concern, Mr. Coleman replied, his hand dropping instinctively to his own weapon. "These Apache killed innocent folks and they're gonna pay for it. That's frontier law." The sheriff's deputy stepped closer, trying to look menacing but failing to hide his nervousness behind a facade of bravado. Jack studied the 2 sisters again, noting details that others had missed. Their hands showed no signs of recent violence, no cuts or bruises that would suggest a fight. Their clothes, while torn and dusty, didn't show bloodstains or other evidence of the brutal murders they were accused of. Most telling of all was their demeanor. They faced death with the resigned courage of the innocent, not the desperate defiance of the guilty. "Funny thing about frontier law," Jack said, stepping closer to the sheriff. "It's supposed to be about justice, not revenge. And I'm seeing precious little justice here today." His words carried across the square, causing murmurs among the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others grew angry at his interference. Emma Littlefoot raised her head and looked directly at Jack, her dark eyes filled with surprise and cautious hope. She said something in Apache to her younger sister, who stopped trembling and stood straighter. Jack didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone. Hope where none had existed moments before. The well-dressed men Jack had noticed earlier began moving closer, their leader's cold blue eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. The man whispered something to his companions, and they spread out slightly, positioning themselves strategically around the square. Jack recognized the movement, military precision disguised as casual observation. "You got proof these women committed murder?" Jack asked, addressing not just the sheriff but the entire crowd. "Real proof, not just assumptions and prejudice?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, and Jack could see doubt creeping into some faces while anger hardened others. "Does Sheriff?" Coleman's face reddened beneath his hat. "We found them near the bodies," he snarled. "That's proof enough for any reasonable man. Apache been raiding settlements for months, killing good Christian folk. Time we sent a message they won't forget." Near the bodies doesn't mean they killed anyone, Jack replied evenly. Could mean they found the bodies, same as anyone else. Could mean they were investigating the murders themselves. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. When exactly were these settlers killed, Sheriff? The question seemed to catch Coleman off guard. He glanced toward the well-dressed men before answering. 3 days ago, maybe 4. What difference does it make? But Jack caught the uncertainty in his voice and the way his eyes avoided direct contact. Makes a powerful difference, Jack said, his voice growing stronger. Because I heard tell that the Apache camp these women came from was attacked 2 weeks back. Burned out, scattered to the winds. How could they murder anyone when they were running for their lives? The crowd began murmuring more loudly now, and Jack could see the doubt spreading like ripples in a pond. Old Pete the blacksmith stepped forward, his weathered face troubled. That's true enough, Pete said reluctantly. My brother-in-law was with the cavalry unit that hit that camp. Said it was a complete rout. Emma Littlefoot spoke suddenly, her English accented but clear. We find bodies of white men, try to help. But soldiers come, say we kill them. We run, but they catch us. Her words carried the ring of truth, simple and direct without the elaborate justifications that usually accompanied lies. The silver-haired man among the well-dressed observers stepped forward, his expensive boots clicking on the hard-packed earth. Gentlemen, he said in a cultured voice that marked him as educated and wealthy, we cannot allow sentiment to interfere with justice. These savages have terrorized our community long enough. Jack turned his attention to the newcomer, instantly recognizing him as the real power behind this rushed execution. And who might you be, friend? Jack asked, though his tone suggested anything but friendship. Marcus Whitfield, the man replied with obvious pride. I represent several business interests in this territory. We've invested considerable resources in bringing civilization to this wilderness, and we won't see our efforts destroyed by Apache raiders. The pieces of the puzzle began clicking into place for Jack. Whitfield and his associates needed the Apache gone to expand their business ventures, probably mining or ranching operations that required access to tribal lands. A few convenient murders blamed on the Apache would justify military action and land seizures. That would otherwise be illegal. Convenient. How these murders happened just when you needed justification for more military intervention, Jack observed, his words cutting through the crowd's noise like a knife through butter. Real convenient timing, Mr. Whitfield. Whitfield's composed mask slipped slightly, revealing cold anger beneath. Are you suggesting that respectable businessmen would manufacture evidence? That's a serious accusation, stranger. I'm suggesting that 3 dead settlers and 2 Apache scapegoats make for mighty convenient timing, Jack replied, especially when the real killers are probably long gone, leaving these women to take the blame. The younger Apache sister, Sarah, had been listening intently to the exchange. Now she spoke up in broken English, her voice trembling with emotion. White men come to our camp before soldiers. They have faces painted like Apache, but walk different. Talk different. We try to warn them about danger, but they laugh and ride away. Her words hit the crowd like a thunderbolt. If white men had been disguised as Apache, it cast the entire situation in a different light. Jack saw understanding dawn on several faces, followed quickly by anger at being manipulated. Sheriff Coleman was growing desperate now, his authority slipping away with each revelation. You're all being fooled by Apache lies, he shouted. They'll say anything to save their necks. We got our proof, and we're gonna use it. But Jack could see that the crowd's bloodlust was cooling, replaced by uncertainty and suspicion. The execution that had seemed inevitable minutes before now looked questionable at best. However, he also knew that Whitfield and his men wouldn't give up easily. Too much was at stake for them to allow their carefully laid plans to unravel. Tell you what, Sheriff, Jack said, his hand now resting openly on his gun grip. Why don't we postpone this execution until we can investigate these claims properly? Give these women a fair hearing instead of a lynch mob's justice. The tension in the square ratcheted up another notch as everyone waited for Coleman's response. Jack could see the calculation in the sheriff's eyes. weighing the risks of backing down against the dangers of escalating the confrontation. In the background, Whitfield's men were positioning themselves more obviously now, their intentions becoming clear. Moment balanced on a knife's edge. And Jack knew that whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of two Apache women, but the future of justice in Copper Ridge. The standoff stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Sheriff Coleman's hand hovered over his gun while his eyes darted between Jack and Whitfield's men, calculating odds and weighing consequences. The crowd had grown quiet, sensing that violence. Hung in the desert air like an approaching thunderstorm, Jack took a careful step closer to the bound Apache sisters, his movements deliberate and non-threatening but clearly protective. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed the crowd while keeping his eyes on the sheriff, "I've seen enough frontier justice to know the difference between law and revenge. These women deserve a proper trial, not a mob execution." From somewhere in the crowd, an elderly woman's voice rang out clearly. "He's right, Sheriff. This ain't sitting well with me." It was Martha Henderson, the preacher's widow, whose opinion carried considerable weight in the community. Her words seemed to give others permission to voice their doubts. "My Sarah wouldn't want us to kill innocent women," called out another voice. "Not in her memory." More murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering, and Jack could see the momentum shifting away from immediate violence. But Whitfield wasn't finished. He stepped forward with the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling situations through money and influence. "Sheriff Coleman, I trust you won't allow this stranger to undermine the rule of law. My associates and I have significant investments in this community's stability." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Coleman's job, perhaps his life, depended on maintaining Whitfield's favor. Jack recognized the corruption instantly. Men like Whitfield bought sheriffs the way others bought cattle, and they expected their property to perform as commanded. "Mr. Whitfield," Jack said, his voice carrying across the square with dangerous quiet, "seems to me you're mighty eager to see these women dead. Makes a man wonder why." The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke, and several townspeople began looking at the businessman with new suspicion. Emma Littlefoot spoke again, her voice stronger now despite her bonds. "This man," she said, nodding toward Whitfield, "came to our village before the attack. He offered to buy our land, but Father refused. He said Apache would leave soon, one way or another." The revelation sent a shock wave through the crowd. If Whitfield had been negotiating with the Apache before the attack, his involvement in the subsequent murders became much more plausible. Jack saw fear flicker across the businessman's composed features before he regained control. "Preposterous," Whitfield declared, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "The ravings of a desperate savage trying to save her life. I've never visited any Apache village." But the damage was done. Several townspeople were now staring at him with open hostility. Young Deputy Peters, who had been shifting nervously throughout the confrontation, suddenly stepped away from his boss. "Sheriff," he said in a shaky voice, "maybe we should listen to what these folks are saying. I never felt right about this whole business." Coleman turned on his deputy with fury. "You'll do your job, Peters, or find yourself another one. These Apache are murderers, and they're gonna hang today." But even as he spoke, Jack could see the sheriff's authority crumbling like adobe in the rain. Jack made his move, stepping between the crowd and the Apache women while his hand rested openly on his gun. "Sheriff, I'm formally requesting that you release these women into my custody pending a proper investigation. As a citizen of this territory, I have that right." "You got no authority here, stranger," Coleman snarled, but uncertainty clouded his voice. The legal situation was ambiguous enough to give him pause, especially with so many witnesses present. "Authority comes from doing what's right," Jack replied calmly. "And right now, that means protecting two innocent women from a rigged trial." He turned slightly to address the crowd. "How many of you really believe these two young women overpowered and murdered three grown men? How many of you can look at them and see killers?" The question struck home. The Apache sisters were clearly exhausted and weakened by their ordeal, hardly the picture of dangerous murderers. Their dignity in the face of death spoke to character that didn't match the brutal crimes they were accused of committing. Martha Henderson stepped forward from the crowd, her gray hair gleaming in the harsh sunlight. "I've lived on this frontier for 40 years," she announced, "and I've learned to tell the difference between killers and victims. These young women are victims, and we're about to become killers ourselves if we go through with this execution." Her words carried moral weight that even Whitfield's money couldn't overcome. More townspeople began nodding agreement, and Jack could see the tide turning decisively against the planned execution. Whitfield's patience finally snapped. With a subtle gesture to his men, he attempted to seize control of the situation through force. "Gentlemen," he called to his associates, "it seems we must restore order ourselves." But Jack had been watching for exactly such a move. As Whitfield's men reached for their weapons, Jack's own guns appeared in his hands with the fluid speed of long practice. The crowd scattered as the confrontation erupted into potential violence. "I wouldn't if I were you," Jack said quietly, his guns trained on Whitfield's men with deadly precision. "I've got no quarrel with any of you, but I won't stand by and watch innocent women murdered for someone else's profit." The Mexican standoff stretched for long seconds while everyone calculated their chances. Jack's reputation with firearms was becoming evident to those who understood such things, and Whitfield's men were clearly having second thoughts about their employer's orders. Deputy Peters made the decision for everyone. Drawing his own weapon, he aimed it not at Jack, but at his own boss. "Sheriff Coleman," he said with newfound authority, "I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. These women deserve a fair trial, and by God, they're going to get one." The reversal was so sudden and complete that for a moment nobody moved. Then the crowd erupted in cheers and chaos as the townspeople realized that justice might actually prevail. Jack kept his guns trained on Whitfield's men while Peters moved to untie the Apache sisters. But the danger was far from over. Whitfield still had resources and determination, and men like him didn't give up easily when their fortunes were at stake. As Emma and Sarah Littlefoot were freed from their bonds, Jack knew that the real battle was just beginning. The sisters' freedom was only the first step in unraveling the conspiracy that had nearly cost them their lives. The truth about the murdered settlers, Whitfield's business interests, and the attack on the Apache village still needed to be exposed. Jack had committed himself to seeing justice done, and he knew that commitment might cost him everything. As the crowd dispersed and the immediate crisis passed, Jack caught Emma Littlefoot's eye. In her grateful expression, he saw both hope and determination. These women were survivors, and they would be valuable allies in the fight to come. The desert drifter had found his purpose, and he wouldn't rest until the brutal secrets of the frontier were finally brought to light. With Sheriff Coleman disarmed and under arrest, the immediate crisis had passed, but Jack knew the real danger was just beginning. Whitfield's men had retreated but not surrendered, and their boss was already calculating his next move. The Apache sisters stood free but weak, their ordeal having taken a severe toll on their strength and spirits. Emma Littlefoot approached Jack with careful dignity, her dark eyes reflecting both gratitude and wariness. "Why do you help us, white man?" she asked in careful English. "You do not know us, you risk much for strangers." Jack holstered his weapons, slowly, aware that many eyes were still watching him. "Sometimes a man just knows what's right," he replied simply. "And sometimes he gets tired of running from doing what needs to be done." The words carried more weight than their simple phrasing suggested, hinting at a past filled with regret and missed opportunities for justice. Deputy Peters, now acting sheriff in Coleman's absence, was struggling to maintain order while processing the dramatic turn of events. "Mr. Morrison," he called out, having learned Jack's name from the crowd, "I appreciate what you've done here, but I need to know more about you. This is still my town to protect." Before Jack could respond, old Pete the blacksmith stepped forward with information that would change everything. "That stranger ain't quite so strange as we thought," Pete announced. "I just remembered where I seen him before." Jack Morrison used to be a cavalry scout, served under Colonel Mackenzie down in Texas, had quite a reputation for tracking an Indian, fighting before he disappeared about 3 years back. The revelation sent murmurs through the remaining crowd. A former cavalry scout helping Apache women was unexpected enough to capture everyone's attention. Jack's jaw tightened at having his past exposed, but he didn't deny Pete's words. "That true, Mr. Morrison?" Peters asked, his voice carrying new respect tinged with curiosity. You really serve with Mackenzie's 4th Cavalry? Jack nodded slowly, his hand unconsciously touching the pocket where he kept that undelivered letter. I did, until I learned that not every order from an officer is worth following, and not every enemy is who they tell you it is. The bitterness in his voice spoke of hard-learned lessons and choices that haunted him still. Sarah Littlefoot, the younger sister, had been listening intently to the conversation. Now she stepped forward with sudden recognition lighting her features. You are the scout who warned our cousins about the attack at Medicine Creek, she said with wonder. The one the soldiers called traitor for saving Apache lives. The pieces of Jack's story began falling into place for those who understood frontier politics. 3 years ago there had been rumors of a cavalry scout who had disobeyed orders and warned an Apache village of an impending attack. The incident had been hushed up quickly, but stories had a way of surviving in the vast network of frontier communication. Jack's expression grew harder as the memories surfaced. I warned them because the attack was based on lies, just like this execution would have been. Innocent people were going to die to satisfy someone else's greed for land and power. He looked directly at Whitfield, who had been listening from the edge of the crowd with calculating eyes. Fascinating history lesson, Whitfield interjected smoothly, but it changes nothing about the current situation. These Apache women are still suspects in a multiple murder, regardless of this man's past indiscretions. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to controlling narratives and outcomes. But Emma Littlefoot had more to reveal. We know who killed the white settlers, she said clearly, her English becoming more precise as her confidence grew. We see them from hiding place when we find bodies. 3 men with painted faces, but they move wrong for Apache. They ride like soldiers, not like our people. The accusation hung in the desert air like a challenge. If the murders had been committed by disguised white men, the entire foundation of the case against the Apache sisters crumbled. More importantly, it suggested a deliberate conspiracy to frame them for crimes they didn't commit. Young Peters was trying to process all the new information while maintaining his tenuous authority. Miss Littlefoot, he said carefully, can you describe these men? Anything that might help us identify them? Sarah spoke up before her sister could answer. One had mark here, she said, touching her left cheek, like knife cut. Another was very tall with yellow hair. Third one had no finger on left hand. The descriptions were specific enough to be credible, and Jack filed them away for future reference. Jack noticed that Whitfield's expression had tightened at the descriptions, particularly the detail about the missing finger. The businessman was clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, and Jack filed that observation away as well. Mr. Peters, Jack said, addressing the young deputy, I suggest we organize a proper investigation of the murder site. If these women are telling the truth, there should be evidence that supports their story. The suggestion was reasonable enough that Peters couldn't refuse without appearing biased. That's a good idea, Peters agreed reluctantly, but I'll need help. I'm not exactly experienced in this kind of investigation. His honesty was refreshing after Coleman's bluster and corruption, but it also revealed the challenges ahead. I'll help, Jack offered immediately. I've tracked enough men to know what to look for. And these ladies can show us exactly where they found the bodies. The proposal made sense. But it also committed Jack to staying in Copper Ridge longer than he might have intended. Whitfield stepped forward with apparent reasonableness. Gentlemen, while I appreciate your thoroughness, I must point out that we're proposing to base an investigation on the word of 2 Apache suspects. Hardly what I would call reliable testimony. His objection carried the weight of racial prejudice common to the frontier. Seems to me their word is worth more than the assumptions we've been operating on, Jack replied pointedly. At least they're offering facts instead of suspicions. The implicit criticism of the rushed execution attempt wasn't lost on anyone present. Martha Henderson, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, stepped forward again. I volunteer to care for these young women while the investigation proceeds, she announced. They need food and rest, and they deserve proper treatment regardless of what happened. The offer surprised everyone, including the Apache sisters themselves. Frontier communities rarely showed such kindness to Native Americans, especially those accused of murder. But Martha's moral authority was such that no one dared object to her proposal. "That's very generous of you, Mrs. Henderson," Peters said gratefully. "I accept your offer on behalf of the town." The arrangement solved several problems at once, providing security for the sisters while demonstrating the community's commitment to fair treatment. As the crowd began to disperse, Jack found himself committed to a course of action that would test everything he had learned during his years of wandering. The investigation would be dangerous, not just because of the desert's natural hazards, but because powerful men like Whitfield didn't surrender their plans easily. Emma Littlefoot approached Jack one more time before leaving with Martha Henderson. "The spirits guided you to us today," she said softly. "Perhaps they have more work for you to do." Her words carried the weight of prophecy, and Jack wondered if his long journey toward redemption was finally nearing its destination. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Jack Morrison prepared for another confrontation with the brutal realities of frontier justice. But this time, he wouldn't be running away from the truth. He would be hunting it down, no matter where it led or what it cost him. Dawn broke cold and clear over the desert as Jack Morrison prepared for the ride to Willow Creek. Deputy Peters had assembled a small posse consisting of himself, Jack, and 2 trusted townsmen who weren't in Whitfield's pocket. The Apache sisters had provided detailed directions to where they had discovered the bodies. Though the site was a hard day's ride through treacherous terrain, Emma Littlefoot had insisted on accompanying the investigation party, despite her weakened condition. "We must show you exactly what we saw," she had argued the previous evening. "Small details matter when seeking truth." Jack admired her determination, though he worried about her ability to endure another difficult journey so soon after her ordeal. As they rode out of Copper Ridge, Jack noticed movement in the shadows near Whitfield's hotel. 3 men mounted horses and began following at a distance, clearly intending to monitor the investigation party's progress. Jack recognized them as Whitfield's associates, and their presence confirmed that the businessman wasn't ready to accept defeat. The trail to Willow Creek wound through increasingly rugged country, past towering red rock formations and stands of hardy desert vegetation. Emma rode beside Jack, her natural horsemanship evident despite her exhaustion. As they traveled, she shared more details about the events leading up to their capture. "My sister and I were gathering medicinal plants when we heard gunshots," Emma explained. "We went to investigate and found the 3 white men already dead. Their camp was destroyed, belongings scattered everywhere. We tried to help, but it was too late." Her voice carried the sadness of someone who had witnessed too much violence. Jack studied the landscape with a tracker's eye, noting signs that others would miss. The terrain told stories for those who knew how to read them, and already he was seeing inconsistencies with the official version of events. "How long were you at the site before the soldiers found you?" he asked. "Perhaps 2 hours," Emma replied. "We were preparing the bodies for proper burial when the cavalry arrived. They saw us with the dead men and assumed we were responsible. There was no time to explain." The injustice of the situation was clear in her voice. As they neared Willow Creek, the landscape became more desolate and forbidding. The creek itself was little more than a trickle during this dry season, providing just enough water to support a small oasis of cottonwood trees. It was here that the 3 settlers had made their final camp. The murder site was exactly as Emma had described it: chaos and violence, written in disturbed earth and scattered possessions. But Jack's experienced eye immediately noticed details that told a different story than the one Sheriff Coleman had constructed. The positioning of the bodies, the pattern of the gunshots, the direction of the blood spatter all pointed to a carefully orchestrated attack, not a spontaneous Apache raid. "Peters," Jack called to the young deputy, "come look at this." He pointed to tracks near the water's edge, clearly preserved in the dried mud. "These boot prints don't match Apache moccasins. And see how they're positioned. These men were shot from ambush, not in a fair fight." Peters examined the evidence with growing understanding. Despite his inexperience, he could see that the physical facts didn't support the charges against the Apache sisters. "This looks like cold-blooded murder," he said quietly. "But if not the Apache, then who?" Emma dismounted and walked carefully around the site, her movements reverent and purposeful. "Here," she said, kneeling beside a flat rock near the creek. "This is where we found the first body. He was face down, shot in the back. No warrior would kill like this. It brings no honor." Jack continued his examination, finding more evidence that supported Emma's account. Shell casings from military rifles, tracks from shod horses, and signs of a struggle that had been artificially arranged to suggest Apache involvement. Someone had taken considerable trouble to create a false narrative. "Look here," said Bill Crawford, one of the townsmen Peters had brought along. Crawford was a former Texas Ranger with sharp eyes and an honest reputation. He was examining scratches on a nearby tree trunk. "These marks were made with a knife, but they're trying to look like tomahawk cuts. Real sloppy work if you know what to look for." The evidence was mounting systematically, painting a picture of an elaborate deception designed to incite conflict between the settlers and the Apache. Jack photographed everything in his mind, knowing that they would need overwhelming proof to convince a frontier jury to believe Apache women over white men. As the afternoon wore on, they discovered the most damning evidence yet. Hidden beneath a pile of rocks near the creek, Sarah Littlefoot found a military-issue saddlebag that had been carelessly concealed. Inside were papers that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy against her people. "These are land survey documents," Peters said, examining the papers with growing alarm, "showing mineral deposits on Apache territory. And look at this letter. It's addressed to Marcus Whitfield, discussing eliminating obstacles to development." Jack studied the documents carefully, his suspicions confirmed in black and white. Whitfield and his associates had been planning to seize Apache lands for mining operations, and the 3 murdered settlers had apparently discovered their scheme. The murders weren't random violence, they were executions designed to eliminate witnesses and provide justification for military action against the Apache. "We need to get these papers back to town," Jack said grimly. "This evidence proves that Whitfield orchestrated the entire conspiracy. The settlers were killed because they knew too much, and the Apache were framed to justify the land seizure. But as they prepared to leave Willow Creek, the situation took a dangerous turn. The 3 riders who had been following them all day finally made their move, appearing on the ridge above the creek with rifles trained on the investigation party. Jack recognized them immediately as Whitfield's men, here to ensure that the evidence never reached Copper Ridge. "Gentlemen," called out the leader, a scarred man matching the description Emma had given of one of the real killers. "I'm afraid you found something that don't belong to you. We'll be taking those papers now, along with making sure you don't spread any more lies about respectable business ventures." Jack's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. But the tactical situation was poor. They were trapped in the creek bottom with little cover, while their enemies held the high ground with clear fields of fire. Peters looked to Jack for guidance, recognizing that the former cavalry scout had more experience with this type of confrontation. "Those papers are evidence in a murder investigation," Peters called back, trying to maintain his authority despite the desperate circumstances. "You men are interfering with official business." The scarred man laughed coldly. "Official business? Son, Mr. Whitfield owns this whole territory, including whatever passes for law around here. You've been poking your nose where it don't belong, and now you're gonna pay for it." Emma Littlefoot had been listening to the exchange with growing anger. Now she stepped forward, her voice carrying across the creek with fierce determination. "You are the killers," she accused, pointing directly at the scarred man. "You murdered innocent men and tried to blame our people. The spirits see your crimes, and they will have justice." The accusation seemed to unnerve the gunman more than any threat of legal action. Frontier men, even killers, often held superstitious beliefs about Apache spiritual power. But their hesitation lasted only moments before greed and desperation overcame their fears. Jack knew that the next few minutes would determine whether justice prevailed or whether the conspiracy would succeed in burying the truth along with its witnesses. As he prepared for the gunfight that seemed inevitable, he thought about the letter in his saddlebags and wondered if he would ever have the chance to deliver it. The moment of truth had arrived at Willow Creek, where the brutal secrets of the frontier would either be exposed or die with those who had discovered them. The gunfight erupted with the sudden violence of a desert thunderstorm. Jack threw himself behind a boulder, pulling Emma Littlefoot with him as bullets whined overhead and splintered the cottonwood trees around them. Deputy Peters and the two townsmen found what cover they could in the rocky creek bed, but their position remained desperately vulnerable. Jack's military training took over as he assessed their situation with cold precision. 3 enemies on the ridge with rifles against 5 defenders armed with pistols and limited ammunition. The odds were poor, but not impossible if they could use the terrain to their advantage and create confusion among their attackers. "Peters," Jack called out during a lull in the shooting, "work your way upstream to that fallen log. Crawford, you and Martina circle right toward those rocks. We need to split their attention and make them worry about their flanks." The former cavalry scout's authority was unmistakable, and the other men moved immediately to follow his orders. Even in this desperate situation, Jack's experience and confidence inspired trust. Among his companions, Emma Littlefoot surprised everyone by producing a small knife from her boot and moving with cat-like stealth toward a position that would allow her to flank the gunman. "Apache women are not helpless," she said quietly when Jack tried to stop her. "We know how to fight when cornered." The battle's tempo increased as Jack's tactical deployment began to take effect. The gunmen on the ridge found themselves taking fire from multiple directions, forcing them to divide their attention and reducing their effectiveness. Jack's accurate shooting with his twin Colts kept them pinned down while his allies maneuvered for better positions, but the scarred leader of Whitfield's men was no amateur. Recognizing the danger of remaining in a static position, he began directing his companions in a fighting retreat toward higher ground where they could maintain their advantage. The movement was skillfully executed, revealing military experience that matched Jack's own. "They're falling back to that rock formation," Crawford called out, pointing toward a natural fortress of red sandstone that would provide excellent defensive positions. "If they reach those rocks, they'll be able to hold us off indefinitely." Jack knew that Crawford was right. Their only advantage lay in mobility and aggression, neither of which would help them against enemies in prepared positions. If Whitfield's men reached the rocks, the investigation party would be trapped in the creek bottom until reinforcements arrived or their ammunition ran out. Emma Littlefoot had been working her way around the gunman's flank with remarkable stealth. Now her Apache training proved its worth as she appeared behind the retreating killers like a desert ghost. Her knife found its mark in the leg of one gunman, sending him tumbling down the slope with a scream of pain and surprise. The sudden attack from their rear threw Whitfield's men into confusion just long enough for Jack to make his move. Rising from cover with both guns blazing, he charged up the slope with the reckless courage that had made him famous among the 4th Cavalry. His accurate fire forced the remaining gunmen to seek cover. Breaking up their organized retreat, the scarred leader turned his rifle toward Jack. But Deputy Peters' shot from the creek bottom knocked him sideways just as he pulled the trigger. The bullet meant for Jack's heart instead shattered rock inches from his head, showering him with stone fragments but leaving him unharmed. Within minutes, the gunfight was over. One of Whitfield's men was dead, another wounded and captured, and the scarred leader had surrendered when faced with the choice between death and prison. The evidence that could expose the conspiracy was safe, and witnesses were alive to testify to the truth. As they bound their prisoners and prepared for the ride back to Copper Ridge, Jack found himself experiencing an unfamiliar emotion, hope. For 3 years he had been running from his past failures, carrying guilt like a stone in his heart. But today's events had proven that redemption was possible for those with the courage to seek it. "The spirits guided your hand today," Emma Littlefoot said as they secured the captured documents. "Perhaps they have forgiven you for whatever sins you carry." Her words cut through to the heart of Jack's pain, offering absolution he had never dared to hope for. The ride back to Copper Ridge took on the character of a triumphal procession as word of their success spread ahead of them. By the time they reached town, a crowd had gathered to welcome the returning heroes and to see justice finally served. Whitfield himself was notably absent. Having apparently fled during their absence, the trial that followed was swift and decisive. The captured gunman, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of hanging for murder, confessed to the entire conspiracy in exchange for a life sentence. His testimony revealed the full scope of Whitfield's plan to seize Apache lands through manufactured incidents and false accusations. Sheriff Coleman was sentenced to prison for his role in the conspiracy, while Deputy Peters was confirmed as the new sheriff by popular acclaim. The Apache sisters were not only cleared of all charges but were formally apologized to by the territorial government, a rare admission of error that helped heal some of the wounds between the communities. Marcus Whitfield was captured 3 days later trying to cross into Mexico with a saddlebag full of stolen money. His mining syndicate collapsed when their criminal activities became public, and their illegally obtained claims were returned to the Apache people. The brutal secrets of the frontier had finally been exposed to the harsh light of justice. For Jack Morrison, the resolution brought a peace he had almost forgotten was possible. Standing in the cemetery where the 3 murdered settlers had been properly buried, he finally found the courage to open the letter he had carried for so long. It was addressed to the widow of a cavalry officer he had failed to save during the incident in Texas. Containing an apology and explanation he had been too ashamed to deliver. Emma Littlefoot found him there as the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The letter brought peace to her spirit, she said, somehow knowing what he had done. And now it can bring peace to yours. Jack folded the letter carefully and placed it in the envelope addressed to California. Tomorrow he would finally mail it, completing the journey toward redemption that had brought him to Copper Ridge. The desert drifter had found his purpose and his peace, proving that even in the harsh wilderness of the frontier, justice could prevail when good people had the courage to stand up for what was right. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jack Morrison realized that his wandering days were finally over. He had found a place where he belonged, people who needed his skills, and a future worth fighting for. The brutal secrets of the frontier had been exposed, and in their place, hope had taken root in the desert soil. The Apache sisters returned to their people as heroes, carrying news that justice could exist between the white and native communities when prejudice was overcome by truth. Their courage in the face of death had saved not only their own lives, but had exposed a conspiracy that threatened the peace of the entire territory. Sheriff Peters proved himself worthy of his badge, becoming a symbol of honest law enforcement in a region too often governed by corruption and violence. Under his leadership, Copper Ridge became known as a place where all people, regardless of race or background, could expect fair treatment under the law. And Jack Morrison, the desert drifter who had pulled 2 Apache sisters from execution, found that sometimes the greatest journeys end not in distant places, but in the courage to stop running and start building something worth protecting.